At 3:42 in the afternoon, with frost still clinging to the cafe windows and her hands still shaking from memories she tried desperately to bury, Eloise made a decision that would either save a stranger's life or destroy her own, as she scribbled 7 frantic words on the coffee cup meant for the man whose name made hardened criminals look away. And the moment she lifted the cup from the counter, her pulse hammering against her throat like a trapped bird, the entire cafe seemed to tilt on its axis, as if the universe itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Her breath shallow and uneven, because she had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to blend into backgrounds, to never draw attention, especially not from men like the one seated by the frosted window whose very presence made the air feel heavier. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever needed someone to see your fear and choose to help anyway, then you understand what Eloise just risked. But stories like this disappear when people watch in silence. So before we continue, take 3 seconds to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments which country you are watching from. Because if you cannot give 3 seconds to a story about choosing courage over silence, maybe you understand better than you think why so many suffer alone. Let us know you are here. Then we will show you what happens next. Matt Greco looked like danger dressed in tailored wool and Italian leather, with his slicked-back dark hair catching the pale winter light, the intricate neck tattoos climbing from his collar like dark vines, and eyes that held the kind of cold calculation that could strip a person down to their most vulnerable truths without a single word spoken, while everyone who entered seemed to unconsciously orbit away from his table. And Eloise did not dare meet his gaze as she approached, her apron twisted in her free hand, the cup trembling slightly as she set it before him with a soft clink against the wooden table. A jolt of pure terror shooting through her chest, not because she found him attractive, though she supposed others might, but because she understood instinctively that men like Matt Greco did not forget faces, did not ignore debts, and never let loose ends remain untied. That what she was doing might be the single most reckless act of her carefully reconstructed life. Yet when she had glanced back at the corner booth and seen Matilda's fingers digging into the table edge, knuckles bone-white, blue eyes glazed with the same paralyzed fear Eloise had once worn like a second skin, she knew she could not look away. That some lines, once crossed, changed you forever, and refusing to cross them changed you too. Matt's hand moved toward the cup, his fingers adorned with silver rings that caught the light like promises of violence, and in the suspended moment that followed, Eloise could swear every sound in the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft jazz floating from hidden speakers, the murmur of oblivious conversations, faded into oppressive silence as his dark eyes lifted from the cup to find her face. His gaze sharp and penetrating, moving across her features with the precision of someone who read fear the way others read newspapers, taking in the tension in her jaw, the way she held herself like she was ready to bolt, the old bruise still faintly yellow beneath her carefully applied concealer, and she felt exposed in a way that made her skin crawl. Yet she held her ground, both hands now clasped behind her back to hide their violent trembling, until he finally spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel dragged across stone, a single question that made her stomach drop. Where? And in that instant, Eloise understood that she had not simply asked for help. She had opened a door into a world from which there would be no safe retreat. In that electric moment when the space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken threat and unlikely alliance. If you are following this story and feel your breath catch the way Eloise's did under Matt's unflinching stare, then stay with us through every dangerous twist ahead. Because what happens next will test everything these two broken people thought they knew about power, protection, and the razor-thin line between salvation and captivity. Matt said nothing more for 3 full heartbeats. Yet his attention never wavered from Eloise, as though he were calculating risk and motive, weighing whether she was extraordinarily brave, dangerously naive, or something else entirely, something that intrigued him against his better judgment. And he lifted the cup slowly, those tattooed fingers rotating it so the desperate scrawl, "Beg patent friendly, IGHT fighter here," caught the pale afternoon light, the letters jagged and rushed, while Eloise felt her lungs burn from holding her breath as Matt's head turned with predatory grace. his gaze sweeping methodically across the cafe, past the couple arguing quietly by the counter, beyond the student with headphones hunched over a laptop, landing finally on the corner booth where Matilda sat trapped like a rabbit in a snare, her red sweater bright against the dark leather seat, blonde hair falling across her face as she stared at the table and the man beside her, Trevor, in his expensive charcoal suit and practiced smile, leaned in with one arm draped possessively across the booth's back, blocking her exit as surely as if he'd locked the door. Matt's expression shifted, not towards sympathy, which Eloise suspected was not in his repertoire, but towards something colder and infinitely more dangerous, a stillness that preceded inevitable violence. While Eloise remained frozen behind the pastry display, her fingers gripping the counter's edge, as if the smooth wood were the only thing tethering her to reality. As the temperature in the cafe seemed to plummet, and even the steam rising from fresh-poured drinks looked suddenly fragile in the changed atmosphere, Matt set the cup down with deliberate care and rose from his seat in one fluid motion, his considerable height making nearby customers unconsciously step back as he moved toward the corner booth, like a dark current flowing downhill. And Eloise's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him cross the cafe, her reflection ghostly in the chrome espresso machine, and she did not know which terrified her more, the possibility that he would do nothing, leaving Matilda to whatever horror awaited her, or that he would do exactly what she had asked, binding Eloise to him through this single desperate act. While she remembered Matilda's voice from 20 minutes earlier when she had ordered, soft, apologetic, the kind of voice that had learned to make itself small, and how Trevor had appeared 10 minutes later, sliding into the booth uninvited, and how Matilda's entire body had gone rigid in recognition. Matt reached the corner booth, and at last Trevor looked up, annoyance flashing across his handsome face at the interruption, a face designed to inspire trust in boardrooms and first dates. But that annoyance transformed into something else when his eyes met Matt's, recognition bleeding into shock, bleeding into the kind of visceral fear that bypassed rational thought, and though Eloise could not hear the words exchanged, she watched Trevor's face drain of color, watched his mouth open and close like a fish drowning in air, watched him attempt to rise before Matt's hand, just one hand, not even touching him, lowered slightly in a gesture that froze Trevor mid-movement as effectively as if he had been physically restrained. Matt Greco arrived at 3:27 in the afternoon, 15 minutes before Matilda would walk through the door with Trevor's hand already possessive on her lower back, and the moment he stepped across the threshold, the cafe's atmosphere shifted like a barometric drop before a hurricane. The bell above the door chimed its usual cheerful note, completely ignorant of the fact that it was announcing the entrance of a man whose name appeared in police files more often than birthday cards, and Eloise felt the change before she even looked up from the espresso machine she was cleaning. It was in the way conversations faltered mid-sentence, how the elderly woman by the window suddenly became deeply interested in her newspaper, the way the businessman who had been speaking too loudly into his phone lowered his voice to barely a murmur. The cafe did not go silent, which would have been too obvious, too dramatic, but it hushed, as if every person present had unconsciously decided that drawing attention was suddenly a very bad idea. Eloise lifted her eyes and understood immediately. Matt moved through the space like an apex predator entering a watering hole, not hurried, not aggressive, simply present in a way that made everyone else feel smaller by comparison. He was tall, probably 6'2", with shoulders that filled out his charcoal wool coat in a way that suggested the body beneath was built for violence even if it was currently restrained by expensive tailoring. His dark hair was slicked back from a face that might have been handsome if it were not so severe, all sharp angles and a jaw that looked carved from stone, and when his gaze swept across the cafe in one efficient assessment, Eloise felt her breath catch even though his eyes had not yet found her. But it was the tattoos that marked him as something other than the businessmen and students who usually occupied these tables, intricate black ink climbing up his neck from beneath his crisp white collar, disappearing into his hairline like dark vines reclaiming abandoned architecture. She had seen men with tattoos before, but these were different. These spoke of affiliations and choices that most people only whispered about after checking to make sure no one was listening. He chose the table by the frost-covered window without looking at the menu board, without asking if the seat was available, simply claimed it the way someone claims something that has always belonged to them. And when he settled into the chair, angling it slightly so his back was to the wall and his view encompassed both the entrance and the counter, Eloise recognized the positioning of someone who never wanted to be surprised. She had seen it before in her ex-boyfriend Ryan, though Ryan's paranoia had been born from cocaine and guilt, while Matt's seemed like simple professional practice. Her coworker Jasmine, who had been wiping down tables with determined efficiency, suddenly found urgent work in the back room. The teenager who usually lounged by the pastry case scrolling through his phone decided his break was over. Even Mr. Patterson, their regular who came every afternoon at 3:30 for his chamomile tea and usually chatted with everyone, simply collected his order from the counter and left without his customary commentary about the weather. And through it all, Matt sat perfectly still, not looking at his phone, not reading anything, simply existing in that space with a kind of patience that suggested he could wait forever if necessary, though Eloise suspected he rarely had to wait for anything. Matt moved toward the corner booth with the unhurried grace of someone who had never needed to rush because obstacles simply removed themselves from his path, and Eloise watched from behind the counter as every person between him and his destination seemed to unconsciously lean away, creating a corridor through the crowded cafe as if choreographed. Trevor looked up from his phone, irritation creasing his forehead at the approach of a stranger, his mouth already forming what was likely going to be a dismissive comment about the table being occupied, but the words died somewhere between his brain and his lips the moment his eyes focused on Matt's face. Eloise saw the exact second recognition hit, saw Trevor's expression cycle, through confusion to understanding to something that looked uncomfortably close to animal fear, his hand that had been resting possessively on Matilda's shoulder jerking back as if the contact had suddenly burned him. Matt stopped at the edge of the booth, not sitting, not touching the table, simply existing in that space with such concentrated presence that the air itself seemed to thicken. He tilted his head slightly, studying Trevor the way an entomologist might study a particularly unremarkable beetle, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that Eloise could not hear the actual words from where she stood, but she could see their impact. 3 sentences, maybe 4, delivered with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather, and Trevor's face drained of color so completely that for a moment Eloise thought he might actually faint. Matt did not raise his voice, did not make threats that anyone could later testify to, did not even change his expression from that flat, almost bored assessment. But whatever he said made Trevor understand with perfect clarity that his life, his comfortable existence, everything he had built or pretended to be, existed only because Matt allowed it to, and that permission could be revoked with less effort than it took to snap a finger. Trevor stood so abruptly his knee hit the underside of the table, making the coffee cups rattle, and he was moving toward the door before Matilda even registered what was happening, his expensive coat still draped over the booth's back, his phone abandoned on the table, fleeing with the single-minded focus of prey that had just realized it was being hunted. The door chimed as he crashed through it, and through the frost-covered window Eloise watched him break into an actual run once he hit the sidewalk, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the winter-slick pavement. And then there was silence, the kind that felt heavy and significant, broken only by the sound of Matilda's ragged breathing that suddenly transformed into sobs, her hands covering her face as her shoulders shook with the release of fear she had been holding trapped inside her body. Matt slid into the booth across from her, not beside her where Trevor had been caging her in, and he said something too quiet for Eloise to hear, and Matilda nodded without looking up, and then Matt was standing again, guiding her gently by the elbow toward the door, where a black car Eloise had not noticed before was already waiting at the curb. He helped Matilda inside with surprising gentleness, spoke briefly to the driver, and then the car pulled away, leaving Matt standing alone on the sidewalk for a moment before he turned and walked back into the cafe. His eyes found Eloise immediately, and she realized with a jolt that made her stomach drop that he had known exactly where she was the entire time, that his awareness of the room was so complete that he had probably been tracking her peripheral movements even while dealing with Trevor. He approached the counter, and Eloise forced herself not to step back, though every instinct screamed at her to put distance between herself and this man who had just made another human being flee in terror with nothing but words. You recognized it because you've lived it, Matt said, and it was not a question. 3 days passed in strange, suspended normality where Eloise went through the motions of her carefully constructed invisible life while a business card with nothing but a phone number burned a hole in her apron pocket, and she told herself repeatedly that she would throw it away, that accepting it had been a moment of weakness, that men like Matt Greco did not offer help without expecting something in return. She worked her shifts, smiled at customers, restocked the pastry case, and pretended she did not feel his words echoing in her skull every time she caught her reflection in the espresso machine's chrome surface. You recognized it because you've lived it. She had not confirmed or denied, had simply stared at him until he nodded once, placed the card on the counter between them, and left without ordering anything, and now it was 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and she was learning exactly why some ghosts never stay buried no matter how many cities you run to or how many times you change your name on apartment lease applications. The sound of her apartment door splintering inward was not loud like in movies, just a crack and a thud that she felt in her chest before she fully understood what was happening, and then Ryan was in her living room, swaying slightly, reeking of whiskey and rage, his eyes unfocused but somehow still finding her with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. She had been washing dishes, her hands still wet and soapy, wearing the oversized shirt she slept in, and for one frozen moment she was 23 again, trapped in their old apartment, learning that apologies meant nothing and locks meant less. He was talking, his words slurring together into accusations she had heard so many times they barely registered as language anymore, something about disrespect and how she thought she could just leave, how he had spent 3 months tracking her down, and she was going to learn what happened to women who embarrassed him, and Eloise felt her body doing what it always did, going still and small, trying to become invisible, until some newer part of her brain, the part that had written a message on a coffee cup for a stranger, screamed that stillness meant death. She ran, not toward the broken door where Ryan blocked her exit, but toward the bathroom, her wet feet sliding on the hardwood as his hand grabbed at her shirt and missed by inches. She slammed the bathroom door and locked it, her hands shaking so violently she could barely work the pathetic brass mechanism, and Ryan hit the door hard enough to crack the frame. Once, twice, his voice escalating into incoherent fury. The bathroom window was small, probably too small, designed for ventilation not escape, but Eloise shoved it open anyway, knocking over bottles of shampoo and nearly putting her fist through the glass in her panic. She was 3 stories up, no fire escape, just a narrow ledge and a drain pipe that looked like it might pull away from the brick if she trusted it with her full weight, and behind her Ryan was putting his shoulder into the door, the wood beginning to splinter around the lock. She went out the window head first, her shirt catching on the frame, her knees slamming into the brick hard enough that she tasted blood where she bit her tongue, and she was on the ledge in the freezing November wind wearing nothing but a shirt and underwear, her phone somehow still clutched in her hand though she did not remember grabbing it. Below her the alley stretched dark and empty, and behind her she heard the bathroom door finally give way, heard Ryan's roar of rage when he found the window open, and her fingers were dialing the number before she consciously decided to, the number she had memorized despite telling herself she would never use it. Matt answered on the second ring with a single word. Where? He found me, Eloise said, and her voice sounded strange, too calm, like she was reporting the weather. I'm on a ledge outside my bathroom window. 3rd floor. He's inside. Silence for one heartbeat then. Address. She gave it, her teeth starting to chatter from cold and shock. I'll send someone, Matt said. 10 minutes. Please hurry, Eloise whispered, and hung on to the drain pipe as the wind tried to peel her off the building like old paint. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building in a neighborhood where Eloise had never imagined she would set foot, all floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's glittering sprawl and furniture that looked like it cost more than she had earned in her entire life. Yet despite the luxury, the space felt less like a home and more like a fortified position, with security cameras visible in every corner and doors that looked heavy enough to survive a battering ram. Matt had not been the one to collect her from the ledge. That honor had gone to two men who arrived in under 8 minutes and extracted her with such professional efficiency that she suspected they had done this sort of thing before, wrapping her in a coat that smelled like expensive cologne and leather before depositing her in a car with windows tinted, so dark the outside world disappeared entirely. And now it was 2:17 in the morning, and she was sitting on a sofa that probably cost more than her car had, wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame, while Matt stood by the windows with his back to her, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low tones to someone about Ryan's current location and what should be done about men who broke into women's apartments in the middle of the night. He ended the call and turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting, and said with the same casual tone someone might use to offer tea, "You'll stay here until it's handled. Guest room is down the hall, second door. Bathroom attached. Whatever you need, tell Angelo and he'll get it." As if it were that simple, as if she were supposed to just accept that her life had been placed on pause while he arranged the pieces on whatever board he played his games on, and Eloise felt something hot and familiar rise in her chest, the same feeling she had sworn she would never ignore again after the last time staying silent had nearly killed her. "No," she said, and watched his eyebrows rise slightly, the first genuine surprise she had seen cross his face. "I appreciate the help. I do, but I'm not staying here. I'll get a hotel, or I'll leave the city, or I'll figure something out, but I'm not going to be someone's responsibility." Matt moved away from the window, crossing the space between them with that same predatory grace she had witnessed in the cafe, and he sat in the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "You think this is about responsibility," he said, and it was not a question. "You think I'm doing this because I feel obligated, or because I want something from you, or because I'm collecting people like some men collect watches. Aren't you?" Eloise shot back, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. So, why does a man like you care if someone like me lives or dies?" Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but becoming less guarded, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its calculated edge. 3 years ago, I looked away when I should have paid attention. Someone I cared about asked for help in a way I didn't recognize until it was too late. By the time I understood what she was actually saying, she was gone. Not dead, he added, seeing Eloise's expression change, but gone somewhere I couldn't follow, couldn't protect, couldn't fix. So when you wrote on that cup, when you risked yourself for someone you didn't even know, I recognized something in you that I should have seen in her. And I'm not making the same mistake twice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to name, until Eloise finally said, "I can't be locked in a gilded cage, even a safe one. I've already lived that life, and I barely survived it." "I'm not keeping you," Matt said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice, though his eyes remained hard. "I'm keeping them away from you. There's a difference. You can leave whenever you want. The door isn't locked. But understand this. Ryan knows where you work, where you live, probably where you buy groceries and get your mail. My world might be dangerous, but right now it's safer than yours. So stay until the threat is gone, and then decide where you want to be." Angelo arrived at 7 in the morning with breakfast from a place Eloise had never heard of, but that smelled like heaven wrapped in expensive packaging, and he was built like someone had taken a bulldozer and taught it to wear suits, all broad shoulders and scarred knuckles, yet he set the bags down on the kitchen island with surprising gentleness and said, "Boss says you take your coffee with cream. No sugar. But I brought sugar anyway in case he got it wrong, because Matt thinks he knows everything, but sometimes he doesn't know shit." And just like that, with casual profanity and extra sugar packets, Angelo made Eloise feel less like an obligation and more like a person someone had actually thought about, which was a small thing that somehow felt enormous in the carefully controlled emptiness of the penthouse. He stayed for breakfast, explaining without being asked that his job was to make sure she had everything she needed, but the way he said it felt less like surveillance, and more like the kind of looking after that families did for each other, and when Eloise asked carefully if he resented having to babysit his boss's charity project, Angelo had laughed so hard he nearly choked on his espresso and said, "Sweetheart, Matt doesn't do charity. He does calculation, and whatever he sees in you, it ain't pity." Sophia appeared that afternoon like a hurricane in designer heels, all sharp edges and sharper intelligence, with Matt's same dark eyes but none of his restraint, and she looked Eloise up and down with the kind of assessment that felt like being x-rayed before announcing, "You're smaller than I expected for someone who got my brother to actually give a damn about something other than business." She had brought clothes, real clothes that actually fit, not the borrowed men's shirts Eloise had been living in, and when Eloise tried to protest that she couldn't accept them, Sophia had waved her off with perfectly manicured nails and said, "Please, I'm not being nice, I'm being practical, because watching you drown in Angelo's old t-shirts is depressing and I refuse to be depressed in my own brother's house." But despite the sharp delivery, Sophia stayed for hours, drinking wine that probably cost more than Eloise's monthly rent used to, and somewhere between the second and third glass, she had stopped performing and started talking, really talking, about what it meant to love someone like Matt, someone who protected fiercely but struggled to be protected in return. Someone who had spent so long being dangerous that he had forgotten how to be safe. Luca came last, arriving near midnight when most people were sleeping, but Eloise had learned quickly that Matt's world operated on different hours than normal society. He was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with wire-frame glasses and the kind of quiet presence that made people underestimate him until they realized he had already calculated every variable in the room and planned for contingencies they hadn't imagined. He sat at the dining table with maps and papers and a laptop that displayed things Eloise suspected she shouldn't look at too closely, and he explained without condescension or impatience exactly what they were doing about Ryan, about the protection they had arranged, about the ways they were making sure certain problems would not resurface. And when Eloise asked why everyone was being so kind to her, Luca had looked up from his laptop with those sharp, intelligent eyes and said simply, "Because Matt doesn't bring people home. And when he finally does, we pay attention." The shift happened gradually, so slowly that Eloise didn't notice until she realized she had stopped counting the days until she could leave and started noticing instead how Matt's schedule had changed. He came home earlier now, sometimes as early as 6, would pour himself whiskey and ask about her day with genuine interest, not the performative kind that people used as social obligation. He canceled meetings, she heard him do it, heard him tell someone on the phone that whatever crisis they were handling would have to wait because he had other priorities. He started keeping food she liked in the refrigerator, started asking if she wanted to watch movies on the nights when sleep felt impossible for both of them, started existing in the same space as her in a way that felt less like cohabitation and more like companionship. And one night, 3 weeks after she had arrived, Eloise walked into the kitchen at 2 in the morning and found Matt standing by the window, and when he turned to look at her his expression was unguarded in a way she had never seen, and she realized with a jolt that felt like touching a live wire that she had stopped seeing him as her rescuer and started seeing him as simply Matt, and that somewhere in the fortress he had built to keep the world out, she had found a place that felt terrifyingly close to home. The message arrived in the form of Matt's restaurant on 5th Street burning at 3 in the morning, flames visible from 6 blocks away, and sirens wailing through the winter darkness, while Eloise stood at the penthouse windows watching smoke billow into the sky like a dark prayer. Angelo had called first, his voice tight with controlled fury as he explained that everyone had gotten out safely, that it was just property, just money. But Matt's face when he ended that call told Eloise that this was something else entirely, something that transcended business losses and insurance claims and entered territory where violence became language. He made 4 more calls in rapid succession, his voice never rising above that deadly calm that she had learned meant he was at his most dangerous, and by the time the sun rose weak and pale over the city skyline, Eloise understood that someone had deliberately drawn a line and dared Matt to cross it, and the someone had a name: Antonio Valdez. Luca arrived at 7 with files and photographs and the kind of grim expression that made Eloise's stomach turn over, and he spread everything across the dining table like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Antonio Valdez ran territories on the south side, had been pushing into Matt's operations for months, testing boundaries, seeing where the walls were weak, and apparently he had decided that the fastest way to hurt Matt Greco was through the woman who had been photographed entering and leaving the penthouse with regularity that suggested she was more than just a temporary guest. The photos were grainy surveillance shots. Eloise walking to the corner store, Eloise getting into Matt's car, Eloise standing at the penthouse windows backlit by interior lights, and seeing herself through a stranger's predatory lens made her feel exposed in a way that was viscerally familiar, like being back on that ledge outside her bathroom window, except this time the danger knew exactly where to find her. "He's giving you a choice," Luca said, not looking at Eloise but at Matt, his voice clinical in the way people got when discussing terrible things. "All-out war, which will be expensive and bloody and draw attention from people we'd rather keep sleeping. Or you give him the girl and he backs off, considers it a win, goes back to his side of the city." The words hung in the air like smoke from the still-burning restaurant, and Eloise felt something cold settle in her chest because she understood leverage, understood how men like Antonio thought, how women became currency in wars they never asked to join. She waited for Matt to start calculating, to weigh options, to consider the practical choice that would save his people and his businesses and his carefully maintained empire, because that's what smart men did when faced with impossible decisions. They chose survival over sentiment. But Matt didn't hesitate, didn't even look at Eloise as he said, "Then it's war," his voice carrying the same weight as a judge delivering a sentence, and Angelo nodded once like he had expected nothing less, and Luca was already pulling up maps and marking territories and talking about alliances and timing and strategic targets. And Eloise sat there listening to them plan violence on her behalf, watching Matt transform from the man who asked about her day into something colder and infinitely more dangerous, and she realized with absolute clarity that she was done running, done being the reason people got hurt, done waiting on ledges for someone else to save her. "Teach me to fight," she said, cutting through their tactical discussion like a knife through silk, and 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. "Really fight. Not self-defense class bullshit, not how to use mace and scream for help. Teach me how to hurt someone who's trying to hurt me. Because I'm not hiding in this penthouse while you go to war over me, and I'm not going to be leverage that gets used against you. So either teach me how to protect myself, or watch me leave right now, and take the target off your back." Matt stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then he said to Angelo without breaking eye contact with Eloise, "Clear the gym schedule. She trains starting tomorrow, 6 a.m. And don't go easy on her because she's small or because you like her. Teach her like you'd teach someone whose life depends on it." "Because it does," Eloise said quietly, and nobody in the room disagreed. 2 weeks of training had left Eloise's body a map of bruises and her hands wrapped in tape to protect knuckles that were learning what it felt like to hit something solid, and Angelo had been true to his word about not going easy, throwing her to the mat over and over until she stopped trying to avoid falling and started learning how to fall correctly, how to make her body a weapon instead of a liability, how to find the soft places on a human body where even small hands could do devastating damage. But training in a gym with mats and rules and the knowledge that Angelo would stop before actually hurting her was different from the reality that arrived at the safe house at 9:47 on a Thursday night when Matt was across the city meeting with suppliers and Eloise was alone except for Marco, the quiet guard who sat by the door reading paperback mysteries and drinking coffee that smelled like it could strip paint. The first sign something was wrong was Marco's phone buzzing insistently, his face changing as he read whatever message had come through, and he was standing up, hand moving toward the gun in his shoulder holster, when the door exploded inward with the sound of splintering wood, and Marco went down hard, blood blooming across his shoulder before Eloise's brain had even processed that someone was shooting, that the violence she had been training for was suddenly immediate and real and happening. In the narrow hallway of a place that was supposed to be safe. 3 men came through the door like a coordinated unit, 2 going immediately for Marco while the third's eyes found Eloise frozen in the kitchen doorway, and she saw him smile, saw him recognize her as the target, saw his hand reaching for her as he crossed the distance between them with casual confidence because she was small and female and looked breakable, and every instinct Eloise possessed screamed at her to freeze. to make herself invisible, to go still and hope the predator would ignore her. But Angelo's voice was suddenly louder than her fear, his words from 1,000 repetitions on the training mat cutting through her panic. When they expect you to run away, run toward them. Use their momentum against them. Go for the eyes and throat and groin because fights aren't fair and survival matters more than honor. So when the man reached for her, Eloise did not pull back. She stepped into his space, drove her knee up hard into his groin exactly like Angelo had taught her, and when he doubled over in surprised pain, she brought her elbow down on the back of his neck with every ounce of strength she possessed, feeling the impact shudder through her arm as he collapsed. She ran then, not toward the blocked door but deeper into the safe house, toward the kitchen where knives and improvised weapons waited, hearing footsteps behind her and knowing she had maybe seconds before they recovered from their surprise that their easy target had teeth. The second man caught her at the kitchen threshold, his hand closing around her hair and yanking her backward hard enough that tears sprang to her eyes. But Eloise twisted into the pull instead of fighting it, letting her body go with the momentum while her hand closed around a cast iron skillet from the stove, and she swung it backward without looking, felt it connect with something that gave a satisfying crack, heard him curse and release her as he stumbled back. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the block, not the biggest one but the one with the grip that felt right in her hand, and she turned to face them with her back to the counter, and the knife held low and ready the way Luca had shown her during the one session he had insisted on teaching her about weapons, about how holding a knife correctly was the difference between defending yourself and cutting your own hand open. The third man was in the doorway now, and behind him, she could see Marco struggling to his feet, blood making his movements unsteady, and the man Eloise had hit with the skillet was holding his face where blood streamed from his broken nose, and the one she had kneed was still on the floor, making sounds like he might vomit. The third man looked at her with new assessment, no longer seeing easy prey, but rather calculating whether the complication was worth the effort, and Eloise stared back with the knife steady in her hand, and said in a voice that surprised her with its lack of trembling, "Next one who moves toward me loses an eye." That's when Matt arrived, his entrance explosive and violent, Angelo and 2 others with him, and the fight that followed was brief and brutal, and over before Eloise's heartbeat had time to slow down. And when the silence finally settled, broken only by the sounds of zip ties being secured and phones being dialed, Matt crossed the kitchen to where Eloise still stood with the knife in her hand, and he looked at the unconscious man by her feet, at the one with the broken nose being restrained by Angelo, at Marco, who was being attended to and would survive a shoulder wound, and then he looked at Eloise herself, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had never expected to see directed at her: respect, pure and unqualified and earned. "You didn't freeze," he said quietly, and it was not a question. "No," Eloise answered, finally lowering the knife. "I didn't." 6 months transformed the landscape of Eloise's life in ways she could not have imagined when she had stood trembling behind a cafe counter debating whether to write a message on a cup that would change everything, and the city that had once felt like a hunting ground now felt like something close to home. Though a home fortified with security systems and people who checked corners before entering rooms, and the kind of safety that came not from naivety, but from power carefully wielded. Antonio Valdez was dead, which was spoken about in whispers in certain circles, but never officially confirmed, his empire fractured and absorbed into territories controlled by men who understood that Matt Greco's mercy had limits, and those limits had been definitively reached. Ryan had disappeared more thoroughly than Eloise had ever managed on her own, and she suspected he was somewhere far away living under the kind of fear she had once carried, looking over his shoulder for shadows that might be Angelo or one of Matt's people, and she found she could not summon sympathy for the reversal even when she tried. The cafe where it all began had changed ownership 3 months ago, purchased through a shell company that Luca had set up with a kind of bureaucratic maze that made tracking actual owners nearly impossible, and Eloise's name was on the paperwork alongside another name she recognized, and when she had asked Matt if he was serious about making her a business owner, he had simply said that she had always seen things other people missed, had always known when someone needed help, and that kind of awareness was worth more than any business degree. The cafe looked almost the same, Same tables and same menu board and same espresso machine that Eloise knew how to operate with her eyes closed. But the back wall now bore a mural that had taken a local artist 3 weeks to complete. A woman behind a counter with dark eyes and capable hands. A man at a table with tattoos climbing his neck, and something almost gentle in his expression. And between them a coffee cup with words scrawled across its surface too small for casual observers to read. But clear enough for those who looked closely. A desperate plea that had become a beginning. Matt had proposed on a Tuesday afternoon in the empty cafe, not with diamonds or grand gestures or the kind of performance people expected from men of his wealth and influence, but with a question delivered in his characteristic directness while they sat across from each other at the same table where he had sat that winter day 6 months ago. "Will you build this life with me?" he had asked, and Eloise had understood that he was not asking her to fit into his world or to be protected by his power, but rather to stand beside him as an equal partner in whatever they were creating together, something that looked like family but felt more earned than blood ever could. She had said yes with the same certainty she had felt when she decided to write on that cup, the same clarity that had come when she chose to fight instead of freeze, and Matt had smiled in a way she suspected few people had ever witnessed, unguarded and real and almost young. Now they sat in the cafe as spring sunlight cut through windows that no longer bore frost, their hands intertwined on the table between 2 coffee cups, his with the espresso he never actually drank and hers with cream no sugar, and Eloise's eyes traced the tattoo on Matt's forearm that he had gotten 2 weeks after the safe house attack, fresh ink spelling out words she had written in desperation that had become something like a promise. "Fight for her," it said in script that looked almost delicate against his scarred skin, and when she had asked him why he had chosen those words instead of her actual scrambled message, he had said simply that those were the words that mattered, the translation of what she had meant beneath the panic, and that he wanted them visible as a reminder of the day a barista had trusted him with something more valuable than her safety. She had trusted him with someone else's. "Do you ever regret it?" Eloise asked quietly, watching customers filter in for their afternoon coffee. Normal people living normal lives who had no idea that the cafe they loved was owned by a woman who had learned to fight and a man who had learned to protect without possessing. Starting all this? Choosing war over the easy solution. Matt lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles that still bore faint scars from training, and said, "Every empire I built was about taking. You taught me what it means to give. So no, I don't regret it. I'd burn it all down again, if it meant keeping you." And Eloise believed him, because she had learned that Matt Greco did not say things he did not mean, and because she had discovered that love was not about being saved but about choosing to fight alongside someone who would fight for you in return. She had done exactly that. He had too. And sitting there in the cafe, where courage had first found its voice, with the mural watching over them like a blessing, they had both won something neither had expected to find. A life built not on fear or power or survival, but on the simple radical act of choosing each other every single day.